Welcome to Art Salon. I'm introducing Aurora Molina tonight as our speaker. Aurora is a Miami artist who comes from Cuba. She came here at the age of 16 and has been part of the Miami community ever since. I've seen her work at the Fat Village projects a bunch of times, including this Saturday night, and at Baca in Pompano Beach, and I'm sure you show in many other places around, but that's where I know you from. And I keep being absolutely stunned by the work that she does. It's always interesting, but it's always different. What holds the work together is that it's always about people. It's always telling a story of some kind, and it's always fabric and embroidery. Aurora has a bachelor's in fine arts from Florida International University and a master's in fine arts from the Universidad Europa de Madrid. I studied Spanish, but it was a long time ago, and it's gotten awful.
You got it.
And she's done residencies and workshops all over the world. In addition to the work that she does herself, she's an art educator, and she works with kids in these different residencies all over the world, fascinating places, and works with the kids there, and as I understand it, helps the kids to learn art using imagery from their own traditions. So it sounds fascinating, and I'm looking forward to hearing her. And I thank you for driving up and being smiling at the end of this journey.
I do need a round of applause for that. Thank you. Good evening. I did left my house at 3:40 to be here on time. So it feels like I'm coming from Cuba rather from Miami. And then I'm driving and I'm thinking, so what kind of narcissistic person I am to be driving 3 hours to talk about my work? But here I am. So I do hope you enjoy it and we could discuss, whatever questions you have. I'm more interested in that than the usual. So it's just a little introduction of how I work with thread. As I like to say, my sewing machine becomes my pencil and the fabric becomes my paper. So this is the medium that I chose, and just to give you a little bit of a background of why. My dad's an artist, he's a painter. So starting art school, I always had these very much presence of his work following me. And sometimes we need to, as this French philosopher says, we need to kill our dads, So in this path of finding my own voice in the visual arts, I discovered a class that was called fiber painting. And to my surprise, I was experimenting painting through different fibers. So it was when I connected to this medium and it started to feel like it was my own voice. And I remember what really connected me was when I was 9 years old, my mom, she signed me up for everything, even volleyball with this height. Not good. But she did sign me up for sewing classes. So it was something that I loved immediately. I connected more to the sewing machine and the machine embroidery than to the hand embroidering. So I got home very excited, and I told my grandma, who was a seamstress, that if she could let me use her sewing machine. She did. After 12 broken needles, I was forbidden to touch the sewing machine, because in Cuba it was very difficult to have the parts replaced, and in fact, she couldn't find any more needles. So when I took that class, I connected right to when I was that age, and I remember how much I enjoy the manual labor, and I thought that I could start just sort of like investigating more into this medium. So I worked for hours. I couldn't even speak English because it had been very recent since I have gotten here. So I used to work, and then I didn't have to talk. That's how I got a free card. I did start investigating more, keep using this medium, and for my thesis, I created this installation that was sort of like using all these different materials, and I worked with people that were my neighbors, immigrants, and I think I was still working the process of adapting to a new country, understanding a new culture, learning a new language. So all those things started to sort of like fall in place. And in the midst of that, I had to create my thesis work for the end of the bachelor's. So I photographed many people that I lived in an apartment building, and most of them were Hispanic descent. So I established a relationship and I started to document them. And what I wanted to portray was the fact that coming from a little town in Havana, you get used to growing up and knowing all these people. But being in a big city, all these people are invisible to others if that's not your environment per se. So with that in mind, I think I started to tell stories unconsciously. And when I look back, this is like 2007, I have been working, following sort of like the same guidelines. I've always been interested in portraying those stories, whether it's that neighbor that it might be my neighbor but not known to many other people, and trying to portray that particular story, or kids or the artisans, always trying to go to those pockets and try to get a little bit more into their stories and portray them through my work. So this is a series of selfies, as you've seen here. I have a show coming up in February. It's gonna be in Melbourne, Florida. Are you guys neighbor? Because I could just stay over. I don't even know where it is. So I've been collecting all these selfies that people send me, and using the idea of how we, through the course of the years, how that we have been given tools to show to the public who we are, and sort of like curating who we are, which if I go back to when I first started to tell those people's stories, we didn't have those tools. So now we have these social medias that sometimes I'm a little biased. I think we're getting lost in these sort of like digital era. But at the same time, I think about the possibility of people to show themselves how they want to be seen, which is another route. I started this project like 2 years ago. They're tiny, sort of the same size of an iPhone, of a selfie, and they're hand embroidered, and some of them are machine embroidered. So far I have 300. My goal for the February show is to have 500. And it's not because of how many I want to collect. I just want to make it seem like there's a lot of them. As we are bombarded with all these images, there's a lot of them, and there's a lot of labor that goes into making one image, when really, when you take a selfie, it's a second. It's less of a split of a second, you know? So I want to have that contrast. There are going to be other pieces. I've been working lately with e-textiles. So it's the idea of the thread and having electricity conducted through. So it's something that I think I'll incorporate into these a little bit. So if anyone here wants to be part of the project, I haven't reached 500, so my email is going to be here. You could go ahead and send it to me. So this is a detail shot, so you could see the texture. Another component on this particular project is the fact that I'm working with artisans. So I also want to use the same idea of things being manufactured elsewhere and used as a product of commodity on this side of the world. So the artisans are being paid for these. And I like that idea that we get an iPhone here, but it's being produced in China or in a factory in California. So I like to bring that back.
Where are your artisans from for this project?
Oaxaca. I went to Oaxaca, I think 5 years ago, and people thought I was going to move to Oaxaca because I was 3 weeks there, a week here, and then back and forth. There's so much. I'm going to declare myself an ambassador because it's a lot that you could go and learn. It's a vast culture, and if you work with the artisans, if you really go to these little towns and you're able to work with them rather than go and suck whatever you could learn from them, you could really establish a relationship. So in fact, I did a project, which I'm going to show here, that was with the kids and the artisans, and we were able to show the whole project that took, the whole production of the project was almost for 2 years. And we were able to bring those artisans into the museum and have a platform for them to give workshops. We worked with an anthropologist in the textile museum, and we were able to sort of found different kinds of stitching techniques that had been gone. So that was very interesting, and the people from the museum were super excited because that's exactly what they want to establish, is a collaboration. And that's what I always give credit to whomever deserves credit. It's, yes, this is my idea, but behind that idea there's this other component that makes the project a whole. In fact, this kid, it's a kid that he's paying off his university with this project. So that's what I keep sending him, and it's like, okay. So he started because on this particular project that you're going to see later, he was 14 years old. And he was trained by this master embroidery, and I have kept working with him because I feel it's very valuable that he gets this as a side job and he's able to go forward with his education. This is in Puebla. This was actually the first trip that I took to Mexico, and then I fell in love. And these were in a train museum. And the reason we picked that place to make this installation was because these characters here that you see are beggars or people that work daily in the Zócalo area in Puebla. So in different trips, I established a relationship with them. I was able to have their permission to photograph them and document them. And the idea was that also the idea of going back to invisibility. What is to be invisible? Like, these people are always there occupying a space in the streets, either selling newspapers, selling peanuts, whatever they do to earn a living. And then what about if one day you walk by there and you don't find it anymore? Are you so used to them being there that are you gonna even miss them? So that was sort of the idea, that you sort of swipe them out of the center and send them to a train somewhere, and then what about if you were gonna miss them? I was able to take photographs and give it to them, and some of them understand it, some of them don't, but that was the idea behind. And I always have a conflict with these pieces because I don't like to use their image to make my work. It's more about their stories that make the work, rather than finding the weak links in society to make work off of. I remember I took an ethical class and we discussed this piece in that regard, because do I really get permission from them to be part of these or not? But I think as an artist, you always find these metaphors, and I think I was just using that idea of invisibility that comes back to the work in this case. But I put it here because we were talking about the cultural identity and those cultural portraits that make up the identity of a place, of a country. So that's why I incorporated them here. All the faces are embroidered, hand embroidered using a specific textile technique that's called puntada de ratón. Don't tell me what's the translation. It's like a cross stitch, but it's longer. It's like woven into the fabric. And I did, I embroidered these, but I learned these with a cooperative of women that were using these to make the huipiles. That's a detailed shot. I think you could see it more here. So it's like a long stitch and then it crosses over, which is, I think it's an sort of like finding a mix between weaving and embroidery. This guy used to sell newspaper. I haven't been back to Puebla to see if they're still there, but I had asked people, and they remember seeing them, and they become sort of like the vernacular characters. I went to Puebla to learn Talavera ceramics, and then it's like, wait. It was the first trip to Mexico, it's like, wait. So I completely changed the project for the residency, and I became so engaged with all the textile techniques. This project, I went to Morocco to Fez to do a photography residency, and we were supposed to, in the whole residency program, we were supposed to go and photograph and document certain things, and the next day we would discuss it and sort of have a critique. So parallel to doing that, because there were specific guidelines, I started documenting again. I think I had recently gone to Mexico, so the idea of maybe the vulnerable parts of society still like somewhere in my unconscious, that I started to look for these individuals, but most of them were elders. And it had to do with patience, and it had to do with waiting. So I will walk the souks every morning. I was there for 2 weeks. And I will find these craftsmen sitting there, just sitting like, you know, like in India and in Arab countries, they sit sort of like, they were just sitting there. Nothing was happening. Fez, per se, it's not a very touristic city. It doesn't get as much traffic as Marrakech or Casablanca. So you could just see sort of like the daily life happening. So I started to photograph them. Again, I established a relationship. I will go and talk about the craftsmanship. We had someone that served as the translator. And I just took portraits of these people. And then I thought about the idea of them becoming marionettes, sort of like moved from one side to the other. I had gone to India and took a couple of workshops on how to make marionettes. So all those things, they sort of like start brewing at one point. But it's this anxiety to gain knowledge, you know, like to absorb a culture and try to touch base with it where you could portray some kind of story. So that is a camel. And for this residency, we had an assignment where we had to do a still life. So for my surprise, I said, still life. You know, what's in here that I cannot find in Miami? A camel head, of course. So I went, I don't know if you've seen pictures of it, but in the souks you have like the lamb's head and all of those parts that they could make a soup with, you know, okay. So I said, you know, a camel's head. And then I started to research on the symbolism of the camel, which is an animal that's very patient, that sort of like supplies water to keep him. So all of those things, and then I created sort of like that narrative, thinking about those elders in the souks. I did buy the camel's head, frozen, when I walked 5 blocks It was dripping blood, and I had 9 cats after me, chasing me because I had the camel's head. And I did take it and photograph it. So this is part of one of those photographs for the still life. In my work, photography is very recurrent, not in the conventional way of a photograph, a 2-dimensional piece, but I transfer it on fabric, or I use it as my starting point, my drawing. So, but I'm always looking, photographing, and then translated that into the different medias. So that's the camel, and then sort of like this installation happened, and you were able to go behind the camel and sort of like you were the puppet. You were able to go in there and put your hands through, and you sort of like talk to the audience. I just proposed a residency in Little Havana. It's first time I'm gonna work locally, but the idea is that I could do my research based on sort of like the vernacular in that neighborhood and bring that in a form of puppets, and I'm gonna work with a performer. My idea is sort of like Waiting for Godot, some kind of monologue. So something like these, locally, I'm hoping that it happens. So again, the puppets, the individuals, and to create a narrative. Sort of like moving away from the object making and thinking about a gallery and an exhibition. This is a project that I started in Oaxaca. I did an educational residency in a little town, 2,000 people. In the outskirts of Oaxaca, that's called Santa Ana Segache. And just, Oaxaca has all these vertebrates, and then you sort of like you're in the border of Guatemala. So this little town, I get there, and I wanted to work with a group of kids. So I get put on the bus with chickens, this and that. It's like, oh my God, where am I going here? It was like 45 minutes to get there, and I was supposed to be there for 2 weeks, doing that every day, going and coming. I said, okay, let's see how this works. Maybe I could just be there for a longer time so I don't have to do these commuting every day. I got there, and this little town has a workshop where they train young adults on how to work oak wood to make the original retablos from the 16th century, using exactly the same techniques as in the 16th century. They have a church, and with the funds of that workshop, they bring the funds to fix all the original retablos from the 16th century from the church. So all of these starts to, I get there, I meet the kids, I have a project. They have a museum in the church, and they have all these original, these are the bigger ones, but they have original retablos with mirrors that served as sono panels. We haven't invented anything new. In the church, and everything, it's like, blah, 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 like started to, I'm started to absorb these. I get back, the kids are lovely, and it's like, why am I gonna come here, give the kids a workshop, and not having them learn anything about themselves? They don't even know they have a museum in their own town. They don't even know what retablos are. They know they have to go to church every Sunday, and everything revolves around the church, but they don't know anything about it. Or like why it's the double-headed eagle even in that church. No one knows about these in there. They had a group of Austrian artists that came because they were very intrigued as to how these retablos with the double-headed eagle landed in there. No one knows yet. We've been still working with a historian, but there are not funds to really do the research. So when I come back the next day, all of these, so I tell one of the kids from the workshop if he could give me a template of one of those retablos, the ones that they were reproducing to sell to bring the funds back to the church, that I wanted to present this to the kids, so when they did their self-portrait, sort of like the frame was one of the original retablos. We go to the church, we start listening to all the stories, and then these happened. These are all the portraits that the kids did in a week's workshop. And the idea was that they work with a self-portrait, and within the self-portrait, they brought different elements that they captured from the facade of the church, which was made as an embroidery because that was the tradition of that town. Now it's gone because they have one of the biggest migratory issues in Mexico. So now everyone, it's gone. The ladies that used to embroider now are working because the husbands are in here. So it was just crazy. And then you could see how important these religious symbols are within the frame of their lives. The cross and the angels, and these are the, what's the name of that little, the one that comes with the dove?
The chair? Olive branch.
Yes, that one. So that's in the facade of the church. It's extraordinary. So they also capture the colors, and we start to look very closely at all these details, and they were able to put it in the portrait. So when you see these, this is a double-headed eagle that comes to Oaxaca through the colony because Austria and Spain had married. Now they had colonized America, and one eagle is looking east and the other one is looking west. So some of them are the eagle, some of them become chicken, some like that, you see? So all of these symbols start to appear. So the kids' work, I kept thinking, it's wonderful that they get to finish the work, but this used to be a town where embroidery was the first and foremost important economical income, and now it's gone. So I went to the church, and there's an embroidery piece in the altar, and I asked who was the lady, and to my surprise, it was the grandmother of one of the students. I had 25, so I talked to her and I said, if I give you a serigraph, black and white, of one of the kids' drawing, would you be able to interpret it in color using thread? So I'll give you the black and white on the fabric, so it's accurate to what the kids draw, and then one in color when it's finished, so you're able to bring the thread and mimic that. And she said yes, and this started a very long process of finishing these portraits and finding the right kind of stitches that represent even the texture that the kids use. Very intricate. This was the exhibit that was at the Textile Museum, and that we were able to locate 60 kind of embroidery stitches. This is a 5-year-old. And then you could see how maybe older kids were more intricate, like the indigenous fruit almost. And then this one, the hearts, you know, how more complex or simple they were as to the symbolisms that they would represent themselves. This one was like, she couldn't stop. She just couldn't stop. And if you see, this is the line drawing that I gave to the artisans. So we had the exhibit coming up, and we had 3 months to finish 25 plus other pieces. And she went crazy. It's like, I can. So I said, this is what we're gonna do. I'm gonna pay you whatever you're charging me for these, and you set the price. She even gave me a lower price, and I said, you're crazy. The first one that needs to start, you know, bringing up the price and making these your autonomy, and I'm bringing your income from, it's you. So this is the price that we're gonna use. You're going to teach other people, that way we get to spread these, and then you're gonna oversee how they're doing with the portraits. And we were able to have 13 artists, 13 artisans that she trained to work on these projects. So when we got to the museum, she was the lead artisan for the workshops, because I learned, but I'm not the one that has been keeping these traditions. So it didn't feel right for me to step in someone else's shoes when they were the ones that needed to feel proud of these traditions. So we had an exhibit at the museum. We were able to get the kids to the museum, and they were so excited, and they came with the parents, and we had, it was wonderful. And they understood the whole process of keeping those traditions alive, which was the purpose of the project. So this is a piece that deals with politics. This was in Art Miami. My dealer is Bernice Steinbaum. I've been working with her since 2011. So it was the first time we were going to do a mayor fair, and I was going to be part of the group in that fair. And the way she does it, it's a little bit unconventional in the sense that most of the fairs are commercial. So you take the artist, whoever's work sells more, you take it there, because the whole purpose is to sell. But the way she does it, she curates the show. So when the fair is coming up, she sort of like thinks about an idea, and among the artists that she represents, we sort of like brainstorm a little bit the subject that we're going to investigate, and then it's like a curated show. All the pieces and work is for sale, but it's a cohesive exhibition. So one piece could speak to the other. So in this particular show, the title was called In and Out of Cuba. So there were artists from Cuba and Cuban artists from the gallery here. So for me, it was the first time I had to think about what that meant, a Cuban artist. Since I was in Cuba, I always knew I was leaving Cuba. Now that I'm in Miami, I have to think what that means. And I went to a personal story. When I was 7 or 8 years old, this was right before the Berlin Wall fell down. Cuba was still linked to the URSS, and it was very regimental, and you grew up being pionero, which is the same thing was happening in Eastern Europe before. So you grow up being a pionero. What that meant was that you sort of like follow the Communist Manifesto, and there was a very strict agenda for them to sort of like brainwash the kids at a very early age. And then it was like after you finished with primary school, then you became a young adult associated with the Communist Party, and so forth, until there was time for you to go to the university. So they would look into the records if you were affiliated to these things, so you were first in line for the openings for art history. Sort of like they start you at a very early stage, and then you go into all these other, you grow up more militant in a sense. So my dad, as an artist, had an opportunity to leave the country in '91. He was one of the first group of intellectuals that left the country and got asylum in Ecuador. And then through Ecuador, he got here because my family had left in the 60s, one of the first openings. And then there were the Balseros in '94. So the sort of like those were the big migrations that you got here. So when my dad left, sort of like the government put an eye on my family. My mom lost her job. She was an architect. My sister didn't get the career that she wanted. And then sort of like the story here, it's that I had to go to a march on a Sunday. And then I said very naively, but from school. So if there was any marches or anything like that, you were supposed to go. Like that was your duty as a pionero. And I said very naively to my teachers, like I can't because I have to go to mass. So once that finishes, I'll join you guys. This is a 7-year-old, you know. I knew that my dad had left, but I didn't understand the political issues around that. So when I go back to school on Monday, they bring me up in front of the whole school and they take the scarf. So now I'm the only kid in school that did not wear the scarf, and that's public shaming. So it was traumatizing, you know, as a kid, like, what did I do? So this all became a big issue. To sort of like round the story, what I intended to say with the piece, it's a kinetic piece. These are motion sensors, and it's the first time I'm playing with kinetics and movements in the work to sort of activate the narrative of the story. So when you walk by it, you have a voice that comes down in a very authoritarian way that says, "Pioneros por el comunismo," and then the pioneros respond, "Seremos como el Che," and they salute. So this was the beginning of sort of like that take on political and social issues in my work. It's still with an interest in the traditional and keeping the craft alive in the work, but I think I stumbled onto a more social conscious work. This was a series of drawings that came with it, sort of like to emphasize how the bunch have to go through these. These started in my sister's generation. So my mom and my dad didn't go through it. The whole movement started after the Boy Scouts came to Cuba, then that transformed into Pioneros Jose Marti, then into communist. And now, to tell you the truth, it's one thing or the other. People are, it's more open. You know, I think what this could have meant, it's not longer, like nothing what happened to me could happen today. So this was a series, this was another series of sculptures. I think this was 2016. And again, it was for Art Miami, and the subject was "Give him the bird," sort of like in, you know, in a jokingly way. So I kept thinking, it's like, okay, birds now. It's like we're in a track, and where do I find that these, without deviating from what interests me, can become a symbol. So I started to do a lot of research. I always had a couple of ideas in mind, but I always need to make sure the idea is solid, and then I get to work. So it's sort of like conceptually I need to tighten all the elements, and then it's like, you know, it's just marathon. So this was an installation. It was very timely, because when I started to do the whole research on the birds, I had this very particular image of Fidel Castro when he declares himself the president of the country. There was this big plate that 2 doves landed on his shoulder when he was giving the speech. So in Cuba you have the syncretism with the Santeria, the African religion, and the Catholic religion, and in both, the bird and the dove become an omen of good luck. So dove as a symbol of peace, and Santeria, it's what you give to the saints as a ritual and to be thankful for, or to ask him for something. So there always have been this myth with the commander-in-chief that he had all the steps of Santeria, and that was what protected him to being in power for so long. So these things started to round my mind. And then Hitler had the same situation with the blackbird? Crow, sorry. And the myth is that the crow told him, it landed on his shoulder in the zoo, and the crow told him what to do to the Jew, and then Chavez will go in front of the whole country with a pet that put the red hat that represented communism. Then you have the eagle that attacked Donald Trump, also that played a role. Bernie Sanders that got the yellow fin on stage in Portland, and then it whispered, and it got him millions of tweets. So all of those things had been used for a political agenda. So again, this is coming back, and the only thing that I did different is that all of them are pooping on them. I did add that. And then the Pope also with the doves as a symbol of peace. So when we got all these political leaders, I didn't want to call them dictators or anything. You give the title as you wish. We said, okay, so what is the Pope playing with all these other leaders? And my galleries decided that he will be giving them the blessings. So that was the way we installed them and sort of like created a little narrative with them. And what makes this piece very timely was that I swear I was putting the last staple on this guy that I had left for last. My brother-in-law, he was having one of those nights that we get together to do a grill, and I said, oh my God, I have to finish the piece, but I don't want to miss it. So I run with all the stretchers, with everything. I'm eating and finishing at the same time. I needed to turn everything in for the fair the next day. And I put the last staple on the back of these, and my godfather calls me. It's like, he's dead. Like, who? He's dead. I left everything, and I said, boom, and I went running to 8th Street. Sorry, I have to confess. So I went there with a metal pot and celebrate. What can I tell you? So the fair opened the next day, and this was everywhere. So, it just became like very timely. This is a piece that started sort of like out of necessity. It started right when the whole political ordeal started with the pre-elections last year. And it's a theater box. I did a lot of research on how theater had been used to sort of like through humor get to the crowds and sort of like manifest a political concern, like Judy and Punch in England and then so forth. So these are all the candidates from the Republican Party and the candidates from the Democratic Party and the president. In fact, I just had this piece delivered back because it was at the Hollywood Cultural Center. And now they are like unwanted children. I don't want to see them anymore, install this piece anymore. So with this piece in mind, I had a solo show that I needed to work on. And this is sort of like the lead way to everything else that you're going to see now, which is the latest series that I have been working on. I had recently, after this piece, I went to Spain and I did my research on the Goya's Caprichos and sort of like understood how he used those caprichos, those drawings, to declare his ideas towards what was established in those times. So sort of like talk about the aristocrats and the political, and how humor again served as a way of getting to the crowds. This was censored. He only got one published book of these caprichos, and they're etching. So metal plates are etched and then printed on paper. So again, using that idea, I started to pay very close attention to everything that was happening from the elections till I completed these. And I got close to 80, but here we show, I think, 50. So it goes chronological to things that were happening. And my show opened April's Fool. and Parkland had happened 3 days before. So that was up to the piece that I did on these caprichos, which was very hard to work on those latest pieces because I can't still get over what happened, and it was in our backyard. So these became sort of like, I need to watch the news and sort of like create a narrative and be up to date. I consumed too much news that I took my boxes, my cable boxes, and I dropped them off, and I said, I don't want to watch TV. I only want to watch Netflix. So this was Parkland. So again, it's all implicit. When I work with political ideas, I don't want to be biased. I do have my opinions and I stand by them, but I don't want to impose anything. I don't think that's the purpose of art. I think what's beautiful about art is that everyone comes with their own ideas and you take it from where you are. And so all of them are faceless. There is a silhouette that sort of like implies who's the person, but I'm not attacking anyone. I'm just saying facts. Some other people may call it fake news, but they're facts. So my challenge here in terms of the medium, it was how do I portray an etching with thread? Etching is something that's very organic, it's very fast. You cannot control it, you cannot erase. So I had to change the sewing machine and find an industrial embroidery machine that had sort of like the same pace, that I could get that stroke of the line like if it was an etching. So in terms of craft, there were things that I had to purposely tweak. And then like in the caprichos, you have sort of like the title that's allusive to the piece. And I only put hashtags that belong sort of like the tweet of the night that refer to what I was trying to portray. So this is all hand embroidered, and again, working with the retablos, I'm bringing those back and sort of like using animals as symbolic parts of the narrative as well. This is a view of the kids walking out of the school, and some of the tweets from people at the train station, sort of like juxtaposing those two ideas. How easy it is to post something where you're not living through it. This was part of what was said, that teachers should carry guns in the classrooms. And I teach most of the times on schools that are, poor neighborhoods. So it's how do you control that? How do you make a call when something like this is happening and you have kids in the classroom? So, thinking about that too. This one, I don't know if you remember when the First Lady called for the Van Gogh that was from the Guggenheim Museum, because you could acquire different artworks to bring to the White House. And the director from the museum told her, no, you cannot have the Van Gogh, but you could have a golden toilet. And the golden toilet is called America, and it's in style and functions, and it's by the Italian artist Maurizio Cattelan, so it was very political. So this was in reference to that. And this is sort of like chronologically where the series starts, with a balance that's held by these jutes of the bull. Again, the eagle as a symbolic reference to the country, and the vulnerability of a deer being hunted. And there's some three-dimensional pieces also. This is a football player. I won't tell you if you read through it. This is the latest piece I completed 2 weeks ago. And this is in reference to the immigration crisis at the border with the kids from Central America. And again, I have very heated discussions with my dad, who's my biggest critic, and I always appreciate that. So he's always telling me, okay, if you look at one side, how's the other side? How are you sort of like rippling that effect on what other people could think that's not your own vision? So we were discussing these, and he said, well, if you do that piece, then do one that talks about the corrupt governments that are the de facto cause of having then those migrants cross the border and putting the kids at risk. And I said, yes, it's all implying there, but I'm not talking about the politicians, I'm not talking about the laws, I'm not even talking about the borders. I'm talking about the kids being separated from their parents. And these kids don't understand, like I did not understand when you left the country. I told my dad that it was for political reasons, that you left because you were looking for a better future for me. I was a kid. So these pieces, I think it becomes personal in that sense, and talks about that separation that these kids are going through. So the black fabric, it's woven in Guatemala by Guatemalan artisans. And I embroider, I don't know if you remember, the black text that were voiced over by these reporters that was able to record at the detention center kids crying and asking for the parents. I was watching the news and this comes up, and it was immediate that I needed to do something with it. So I scale it up. It takes 10 feet by 18 feet. And the gate, it's sort of like an implicit element of being gated, of being separated. And that's it.